Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. It's Craig Trulia. And with me today is Father John Whiteford and Father Joseph Suaiden. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good, thank you.
Yeah, pretty good.
Now, and guys in the comment section, just let us know if we need to make any adjustments with audio. This is a very important topic for me, not because I feel very personally invested in it, but actually for the sake of, I feel in decades' time, this could be a division that is healed, that will be healed. And so if people want to know what my alternative motive is, it's like, well, let's talk about the issues. Let's talk about the history in a respectful and impartial way. Give both sides as much as possible equal time to tease out the issues, because these are sort of things that will have to happen ultimately for there to be any healing in the schism, depending on which side's wrong. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Healing is going to require that the issues are brought to bear and corrected. And so I'm very grateful that Father John and Father Joseph are here today to speak about the issue. And of course, your comments are welcome, audience. You could leave comments live, comments not live. We obviously cannot cover every possible view within True Orthodoxy and World Orthodoxy. We're just covering the views of the guests that are here today. So how's that sound, guys?
Wonderful.
Sounds good to me.
And so, instead of getting to introductions, I feel that some of your guys' backstories in Orthodoxy will come out when we just start asking the questions. So if it's okay with you, we're just going to jump right into it.
Sure.
All right. And so that being said, I want to ask a kind of basic question, but it's almost like baselines things. And I'll have Father John answer this first. Does ROCOR recognize holy orders in any True Orthodox jurisdiction?
Well, I know that we have received clergy from them, and so on some level, I would have to say yes.
All right, so the answer is yes, because there's been clergy received without being baptized and ordained again, you're saying.
Right.
All right, and so same question you, Father Joseph, about the True Orthodox receiving ROCOR clergy.
I would say that they would probably at least, I would say that it would be dependent on the circumstances, but it's always been that way, in the sense that, especially with the Greek Church, they make a much bigger deal about things like whether you were received by baptism or not. So in some cases, there have been cases, one of which led to a rupture between the Synod of ROCOR and Archbishop Maxentius. If they discovered, for example, that a priest was made, but he had not been, he came from Roman Catholicism, but he hadn't been given a baptism but a chrismation, sometimes they will do a corrective baptism, that sort of thing.
So in short, they'll recognize the holy orders of ROCOR, generally speaking, because obviously you can't speak for every True Orthodox jurisdiction.
Right.
But in the event that, let's say, that person was received into ROCOR in a way that they consider unsatisfactory,
Right.
those elements may be corrected.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
and that's oversimplifying. I should say that because, again, different True Orthodox.
No, I bring this up just so people, yes, there's a schism, but this is not to the same degree, being that there's recognition of holy orders. There might be in some other situations. And so I want the audience to know this, because a lot of the audience is not even Orthodox, or Protestants that dabble in this issue, and Roman Catholics, and they don't know some of these basic things. A monk friend of mine was telling me, because he's a friend with a canon lawyer who's a bishop. I won't say the jurisdiction. But long story short, that the bishop has which True Orthodox jurisdictions they accept the holy orders and which they don't. So this is sort of for people to know things that they're aware of and that do exist. And I just thought maybe it's something that the audience might have not been aware of. So I just wanted to bring that to bear. Unless there's any other comments, I will move on to the next topic. Anything you want to add, Father John?
Not on that question.
And Father Joseph, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think I'm good for now. I mean, I was
Okay.
going to bring up a personal anecdote, but it's not necessary.
All right, well, we'll see where this takes us. So next question, and just again, for the sake of keeping things timely, How has ROCOR in the past created True Orthodox holy orders? Father Joseph, you mind give us a little bit of a background of how did ROCOR become intertwined with the hierarchies that exist today in some True Orthodox jurisdictions?
Well, if we're going, okay, oof, that's a many-sided question.
Right.
Okay,
You got 3 minutes or less.
oh, great. Okay, well, in that case, before the 1962 consecrations, which is how most people think in terms of the intertwining of ROCOR and True Orthodoxy, you have to deal with the fact that True Orthodox hierarchies, for the most part, it was just the Greeks, were small, pretty scattershot. There were 3 bishops originally. It went up to 7 bishops, and then it went up and down based on whether some left for the new calendarists or separated from the rest of the groups, etc. But it's important to remember that while this was occurring, it was not as simple as the Greek Old Calendarists and ROCOR. If you take into account the Vatopedi Synod in 1930, then at that point, the Slav parties, when they were discussing with the Greeks, were actually horrified by the fact that they wanted to do concelebration. And so, for example, St. Nikolai Velimirovich actually gave chrism to the old calendarists before they had bishops. So, in Romania at the same exact time, you're finding it's absolute chaos because of the fact that the Romanian authorities are trying to establish a papal calendar. So while this is happening, ROCOR is basically in Serbia trying to survive. So to make great demands of the Russian church abroad in the 1930s and 40s would have been ridiculous because, frankly, everyone was trying to just survive the onslaught of whether it was communism, Venezuelism, etc. So yeah, it was not pretty. But most people think about the background of the ROCOR-True Orthodox unity occurring basically with clandestine ordinations that occurred in 1962 by Bishops Theophilus Ionescu, and who was a New Calendar Romanian bishop, although that was pastoral. And I've forgotten who the other bishop was, and I should have that.
I believe it was Archbishop Leonti of Chile.
Leonti of Chile. Thank you, Filipovich. Thank you very much. And so the point is that those original ordinations, etc., consecrations were clandestine in 1962. They were unknown to the rest of the ROCOR Synod even, and it wasn't until they eventually said under the table, like internally, what they did, etc. And by 1969, if I remember correctly, this is right after the lifting of the anathemas, about 4 years after the lifting of the anathemas in Constantinople, the bishops eventually talked in ROCOR and said, well, we did these consecrations. We're going to go so far as to recognize them. And that was under the presidency of St. Philaret of New York. And so that's really kind of how that started. Now, at the same time, there are movements like, for example, in Romania, there was a new calendar bishop who repented, Metropolitan Galaxian Cardun. And so there's like small trickling movements trying to survive the state authorities, communism, etc. So that is part of the problem. So yeah, it was a different world than the one we think of, where we think of a unified world orthodoxy and true orthodoxy. It was an absolute global chaos for the better part of 40 years.
And we'll begin unpacking some of that. But Father John, anything you want to add other than the basics that in the 1960s, ROCOR played a role in reconstituting the Greek Orthodox Old Calendar's episcopal hierarchy?
Well, just a few details. There were bishops of the Greek Old Calendarists prior to that, but they died off. And so they were left with no bishops. And in 1962, you had these 2 bishops, as Father Joseph pointed out, one of whom was on the new calendar. He was the head of the Romanian New Calendar Diocese in ROCOR. We also had a New Calendar Diocese that was Bulgarian at that time. And
which is ironic.
They did this without the blessing of the Synod, and actually the Synod of Bishops declared those consecrations to be invalid. But then later on, after the lifting of the anathemas, the Synod of Bishops decided to go ahead and recognize them. And then I think a couple years later, and there was an attempt to actually enter into regular concelebrations and communion with the Greek Old Calendarists, but a couple of years later they broke off because the position of ROCOR was, is the Greek Old Calendarists can't get along with each other. We'd be happy to be in communion with them or to concelebrate with them, but they need to get their act together. And so there wasn't any formal links between the two after that, although there were friendly relations with some bishops. But it was only in, I think it was 1996, that ROCOR decided to enter into communion with the Kyprianos Synod and also with
94.
the Romanian, Bulgarian Old Calendar group that were in communion with them. And so I remember that I was in ROCOR at that time, so I remember that time very well. And one thing that was a bit striking about all that is that for about maybe a year or two, it seemed like everything was going along swimmingly. And then after that, you saw the bishop stop concelebrating. And I don't know entirely what was going on the Episcopal level, but we had actually two parishes in Houston, both of which later closed because the priests moved away. And in both cases, because the Archbishop had required them to not serve in storefronts, they had to build a chapel on their property. But when they had to move, that meant that the chapel went away, so the parish wound up going away. But anyway, we had good relations with them at that time, and I actually thought seriously about asking for a release to the Kyprianos Synod, just because the only ROCOR parish in the Houston area was doing most of the liturgy and feast day vigils in Slavonic, and these parishes were doing stuff in English. And I thought, well, gee, that would be preferable to the situation that I'm in. The only thing that kept me from doing it was my wife had her spidey senses saying, I don't think this is a good idea. And later on, I was glad that she had those senses, because even though there are a lot of good people in the group that I was familiar with, there were things about how they actually ran things that struck me as a bit squirrely, and I was glad to stay in ROCOR rather than to take that.
We'll unpack the 2000s and the 90s and get into some of that. But let me just say one thing before I forget, just from what I know studying history. And I'm not an expert in contemporary Orthodox issues, but historically speaking, like, let's say a metropolitan, a patriarch, a pope, they can't just decree something and it makes it so. You need the whole synod on board for these things. And that includes episcopal consecrations. And so it is something which doesn't get discussed a lot in online arguments, or people look into stuff in a passing sort of way, where they think, oh, well, it was done by a bishop and that makes it so. But in a historical sense, we tend to want to look at these things synodically. Well, how did the synod respond to this action? The local synod, and then the world synods in conjunction with the local synod. This comes up historically, so it's, I think, something which will be telling when we look at some of these other issues we'll be unpacking on this question, is whether or not the synod makes something more convenient or less convenient to both sides' cases. Now, let me start with Father Joseph with this, which is in 2007, ROCOR and the Moscow Patriarchate entered into communion with one another. And from what I'm aware, that Metropolitan Loris of ROCOR wrote to the Old Calendar jurisdictions, I believe in Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, expressing their desire to remain in communion with them, but saying we're going to be fighting ecumenism essentially from the inside of world orthodoxy. This was not responded to favorably by any true Orthodox jurisdiction. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and say this seems to me to be the point of schism, because we have one side saying we want to be in communion and the other side saying no. So my question for you, Father Joseph, would be one, or is at least the facts at hand accurate? And two, could you give us some other details? Because obviously you wouldn't agree with this, why that would not be the cause of schism, unless you do agree.
No, I don't. And I think I'm again. This goes into the question of the history of the Russian Church itself. And so, for the one thing I'm not going to do is try to defend the indefensible and pretend that ROCOR was a monolith that had a unique, singular viewpoint the entire time. I think neither of us would say that, because it isn't true. What I would say is that around the time of the fall of communism, you find it again that it turns out that ROCOR had secretly sent bishops into Russia clandestinely, and by 1990 to 1994, you had an organization known as the Free Russian Orthodox. This is not even talking about the catacomb Orthodox that were already there, and I know we've talked about that on another show with the corruption of Vincent Jekyllin, but the point is that you had an entire hierarchy complete with thousands of people and hundreds of parishes that existed in Russia. And so from the True Orthodox perspective, and again, they knew about them in Greece and Romania, so on and so forth. They would be the Russian church. So they didn't consider, as at the time many in ROCOR didn't consider the Moscow Patriarchate to be the legitimate successor church of Russia. So it would be weird, because with the reunion, this presupposes that the Moscow Patriarchate and the ROCOR were both parts of the same church. Whereas in Greece and in Romania and Bulgaria, it's obvious they're not. They consider each other schismatic. And up until probably the 2000 Council of the Moscow Patriarchate, that's pretty much how ROCOR and the Moscow Patriarchate, at least officially, looked at each other as well. So it's important to remember that it would be illogical to say the 2007 schism was or the 2007 union was the moment of schism, because of the fact that the other True Orthodox that we're talking about wouldn't have recognized the Moscow Patriarchate to begin with, and would have followed that to its logical conclusion.
So if you don't mind, Father Joseph, let me just to make clear, because ROCOR and ROCOR considered the Moscow Patriarchate a schismatic body, right? They were in schism from ROCOR.
Mixed proposition. There was always two minds in ROCOR.
But where I'm going is this: forget Moscow Patriarchy. I'm saying ROCOR, because the name of this show is the ROCOR and True Orthodox Schism, right? And so I'm trying to identify the date where ROCOR and True Orthodox are no longer in any sort of sense together anymore, and there's a schism between the two.
Oh, okay. I thought
and so with 2000,
your question. I thought that you were saying when did the old counterists become schismatic from ROCOR?
No.
That would be the ultimate moment of separation. Would be 2007. Yeah.
Okay.
Although I think it was in 2006 that they actually separated, and then 2007 the letter was written, but by then the Greeks and others were like, no.
And so it sounds to me that we're in agreement that in 2006, this is when there's no commemorations from any True Orthodox jurisdiction. And in 2007, Metropolitan Loris writes, hoping that maybe that could be reversed, and that's just not the case. And then it's kind of that seals the deal. Would that be accurate for the True Orthodox and ROCOR?
I would like to say that is a matter of perspective.
Okay, well, please explain.
And what I mean by that is that Father John has known me for a long time, and so I was in, different True Orthodox bodies. But from that perspective, 2007. This is 6 years after the whole thing happens with Metropolitan Vitaly. It's a good 15 years after the whole ROAC, Free Russian Orthodox Church thing. The Greek old counterists, the Bulgarians, etc., they had all seen this. They'd seen this play out in real time. There was an underlying narrative that there were people in the synod who were pushing for union with the Patriarchate. So that 2007 letter, if you take all of that history and that perspective into account, looked like a stab, almost looked like a punch in the face, or a stab. It's like an insult. Like, obviously, the True Orthodox of Greece weren't going to reunite with the new calendarists. The True Orthodox Romanians weren't going to go to Bucharest and ask for forgiveness. None of that stuff was going to happen, because that's not real. So to say, oh, why don't you come with us? It's like laughing at us.
And so it would be fair to say when Metropolitan Laura said, listen, we want to be a voice of true orthodoxy within world orthodoxy, and we want you to, essentially be in communion with us because that's what we want to do. They saw that as duplicitous and pretty much spitting in their faces.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, on the same question, Father John, would you agree that 2006, 2007 is really the dividing line between True Orthodox and ROCOR, where the schism was consummated?
You could say that was the final dividing line. But one thing I would say about that is that when Metropolitan Loris issued that letter, there was no statement that this is how reconciliation between these different groups would be. It was just basically saying we're doing what we're doing. We would like for y'all to remain in communion with us. We're hoping to facilitate a discussion. And I remember when I think it was probably the first time I heard Archbishop Chrysostomos of Etna speak, who always struck me as a very intelligent man, and I was impressed by him. But I remember him saying, we would be happy to talk to the State Church of Greece anytime, anywhere, but they won't talk to us. Well, here they were handed a golden opportunity to talk to State Church of Greece, because the other end of it was the Moscow Patriarchate was talking to the State Church of Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria, and asking them to enter into a discussion with these groups. And so if they had entered into the discussion and then said, well, look, they're asking us to do stuff we can't agree to, then I think that I would at least said, well, they're being consistent with what they've said, but they weren't even willing to talk. And of course, there's other things about sort of the history prior to that we should talk about. But as far as 2007, that would be...
We're definitely reversing into that, Father.
Yeah.
And because I feel that it's so easy. And I could be wrong, but in this topic, it's so easy to then just start getting to, but you did this wrong thing in 1980 this, you did this wrong thing in 1930 that, where it's, unless you start like pretty much in the present and kind of slowly walk your way back, you'll just get lost 1,000 details really far away. So that's kind of the logic behind it. Now, Father, unless I am interrupting another pertinent point about 2006 or 7, and I apologize if I am, I'm going to pose this question to you, Father. It says that even in 2007, the ROCOR gave canonical release for bishops to come to Hatka. And they are the remaining bishops confessing the faith, and the parishes overflow with grace. So this is obviously someone from Hatka. My question is, could you give a comment, Father John, on what was the nature of the canonical releases in 2007 in ROCOR, being that you were a clergyman there at the time?
Well, it's hard to keep track of True Orthodox groups because their acronyms keep changing. So I'm not entirely sure what Hatka even stands for. But I don't believe any bishops were given releases to those groups. I know of a priest who was given a release, but a release to no one in particular, that wound up going over to, at that time, I believe it was the Chrysostomos Chiusa Synod, which is the more numerous. I know that there was some sort of a merger, but I stopped paying studious attention to Greek Old Calendar, maybe about a decade ago. But I was glad to see that they were at least coming together on some level. But I only know of a priest that was given a release. If there's a bishop they're saying was released, I'd like to know who it was, because I'm not aware of any bishops that were given a release. Yeah. There were some bishops who just chose to leave. Metropolitan or Archbishop Agafangel, when he left us, was the only one that I know of off the top of my head that went into schism at that time. There were some that went into schism with some other groups prior to that.
Now, Father Joseph, do you have anything to add about the canonical releases during that era or no?
If you don't, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I know that they did occasionally happen, and they usually happened with larger groups. The Hatka sounds an awful lot like the Hakna, but it's not. It's actually the GOC Kalinikos. I feel like sometimes people chose acronyms that sounded very similar to each other. for less than great reasons. However, I will say that that did occur. I know in 2007, and I do know that when Metropolitan Agafongo left, he left alone, which is why they had to assist him in making bishops.
Now, it's relating to what you were discussing. We have a Protestant viewer who says, I'm so sorry, but I'm curious Protestant that follows this channel to learn more and hopefully grow. Can someone define terms for me, what they're juxtaposing here? I'm going to leave this to the audience because this is such an in-house issue. It's terribly hard to simplify. And just even the acronyms. I will make this one general observation. Regrettably, almost everyone hates everyone else on this question. And so for that reason, you'll see Father Joseph and Father John making side comments about the acronyms, and it's pretty much, for those who aren't Orthodox, you're kind of walking into a family squabble. And so you're going to be getting some of these kind of offhand comments and stuff. And I would just say you just kind of have to sit back and kind of soak it in and maybe Google some of these things if you don't understand.
Please Google. Yes, please Google.
I have a few funny things so we get back to the serious stuff. I once met Father John in person. I was pleasantly surprised by how tall he was. How tall are you, Father John?
6'2" last time I was measured, although I may have shrunk a little bit with age.
6'2", yeah. No, I'm a short 5'10", and how about you, Father Joseph?
I was 6'4", but I'm heading towards 6'3.5".
My gosh, I am the shrimp here. All right, here's a good question: who has more feds, ROCOR or True Orthodox?
Well, I can tell you one thing is at the All Diaspora Council of 2006, which is where they made the decision to go into communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, Archbishop Agafongo had a representative, a lay delegate there who was being very vocal, and his name was John Herbst, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine under George W. Bush. And there were black vans out in front of the cathedral monitoring the situation. So I think on that occasion, the people who wound up going to the Schism had more feds with them than we had with us.
I think when they take the conciliar minutes, they should have votes for the Fed handlers, and they get to vote alongside. What do you think, Father John? It's like
I think he's just leaving that at no comment. Ironically, when many of the parishes broke off under Archbishop Andronic, when they broke away from Agafongo, they did actually bring that up because they were like, that the Fed thing has been around everywhere.
On a serious note, I don't know again too much about U.S. political culture and exactly how they've infiltrated all sorts of groups, because certainly that has occurred. When I could think of some of the best voices during COVID, like Patriarch Ilya and Patriarch, and that's in Georgia, and Patriarch Neafit in Bulgaria, they had, KGB names and stuff. Some of these guys weren't, but they weren't sellouts, and it showed during COVID that they weren't sellouts, right? In fact, if I remember Patriarch Neafit, his KGB file essentially said he's actually devout. Right? So meaning they all had to register with their local KGBs, well, but doesn't mean they're all sellouts.
Patrick is a unique story, though, because even though he learned from his experience, one thing I will say about Patriarch Ilya is that over the years he was very intelligent. It can be argued in 1997 when he left the World Council of Churches that was basically opportunistic. However, since then, he also helped restore Georgia's demographics by promoting the whole "I'll be everyone's godfather." So in other words, he learned a lot from his mistakes. But he does even show up. Like if you look at the lives of two of the drunken saints, one of the ones who would be considered canonical, that would be Elder Gabriel of Georgia, and then you look at Archbishop Gennady Sakach, who was both of these were wandering fool for Christ types that would cover themselves in alcohol, so on and so forth. So people would think they're drunks. And so what ended up happening was, in the case of St. Gabriel, He actually Ilya figures in both their lives. So he actually showed, Ilya's like, why don't you just come under me? And he was like, okay. So he gets a house. And when he did this, the same thing happened with Archbishop Gennady. He said, no, I don't trust you. I think you're an arm of the KGB. And so the guy was like, okay, fine, I'll have you arrested. So, the point is, but he was in the middle of one of the most terrifying and powerful and weird times of the church, which to some degree we can't even understand as Americans, because it was very much a different story in our lives.
And that's why I'm just focusing on COVID and not entirely the past. I'll do a couple more questions, and then we will get right back into some real important stuff. Dioscoros, who's Oriental Orthodox, asks, the majority of churchgoers in Greece, specifically True Orthodox rather than World Orthodox? And I would say no. Father John, what's your answer?
I would say it's not even close.
And Father Joseph, do you concur?
I would say that it's. I would say it's. I wouldn't go not even close. I would say it's probably at this point probably around a quarter of the population.
All right.
That seems like a bit of an overestimation. I think that, matter of fact, I remember Archbishop Chrysostomus's the Orthodox Tradition journal used to make regular comments about jurisdictions that exaggerated their numbers, and I think a lot of the numbers that get exaggerated among the Greek Old Calendarists are based on how many people show up for their feast days. And the thing is, you have a lot of the same people showing up for their feast days that normally show up at New Calendar monasteries' feast days too. So you can't just say there was X amount of people that showed up, so these people are all counted in the number.
Well, I was actually going by the numbers based on the Moscow Patriarchate's representation to the Kallinikos Synod when they came to Greece. They estimated that it was between 2 and 4 million, and the population of Greece is 12 million. So that implies that it's either a quarter to a third of the population.
And definitely both sides follow up with citations, with stuff in the com box. Obviously, if it's not handy this very second, I'm not.
But it's definitely not the majority.
Yeah.
So there we go. We agree on that.
And by the way, if people are wondering when my finger is by my ear, I'm having trouble hearing. we were discussing this before we came online, so that's the reason why.
Father John's listening to his Fed handler.
Yeah.
We have this.
Right. That's mean.
Oh, I don't mean it. I'm sorry, Father John. You're the best thing that's ever happened to this channel. Let's be honest. So, True Orthodoxy recognizes ROCOR MP ordination of sacraments. Is it via economia? Father Joseph, could you explain on what basis a True Orthodox jurisdiction would recognize ROCOR sacraments?
Yeah, no, it would be. He's right. It would be economy. But this is kind of, we forget how much economy is used. Now, was that the case in the 1970s when they recognized each other? I would say even in the 1980s, before the formal union with the Synod and Resistance, that it was not a case of economy, but that would be more of a case of general recognition, because at that time they were more even informally in communion. But at this point, it's definitely the case. Father John, I think, remembers a couple of years ago, maybe a few years ago, when I had an issue with my bishop. I left the communion of my church. I was actually considering going to ROCOR, and I actually called Father John about that. And he was very hopeful and very ironic about it. So I called Metropolitan Hilarion, where it's a long story, but in any case, he did talk to me for about an hour. But what he did say very clearly was that people who were received by him, and this is eventually I found out that wasn't 100% accurate, but if it's 75% accurate, it doesn't matter. He actually said he'd reordain me. And as a deacon, even I was just like, I said I have to think about that, but I had no intention of being reordained, so I just hung up on that, nicely.
That means have a great day. Goodbye.
I didn't, you be polite,
No, it's let's get into a very important question, which is whether the 2007 agreement, the restoration community between the MP and ROCOR, whether it invalidated earlier synodical actions of ROCOR, such as the 1983 condemnation of ecumenism. I'm going to quote something from someone in the audience. Someone else could tell me whether this is an accurate quote. says acts issued previously which preclude the fullness of canonical communion are hereby deemed invalid or obsolete. So I'm going to pose this to Father John because he's in ROCOR. Is it your understanding in 2007 when communion was attained between MP and ROCOR that this agreement, like the quotation we're seeing here, did it invalidate earlier synodical actions, or is that an inaccurate synopsis of what that means and what they were trying to accomplish in 2007?
It was, that statement was in there because of things like maybe deposing clergy that went from one jurisdiction to the other and things like that. But it wasn't related to the anathema against ecumenism, because the anathema against ecumenism didn't specifically condemn any local church. It just said that if anybody teaches these things, let them be anathema. But basically there were three issues that that ROCOR was concerned about before it would consider reconciling with the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, four, I guess, if you count number one, they had to no longer be under Soviet authority. Number two, they had to condemn ecumenism, and number three, they had to condemn Sergianism, and number four, they had to glorify the new martyrs. And in 2000, they did all those things. Now, when they condemned Sergianism, they didn't say, we condemn Metropolitan Sergius to hell. But if you read their statement on the relationship between church and state, they condemned what we define as Sergianism. And they also, in their document about the relationship with the non-Orthodox, they condemned ecumenism as we understood it. So basically, that's when it was after that council that the question of reconciling with the Moscow Patriarchate became a hot issue. And if you don't want to talk about this just yet, I can defer it. But in ROCOR, prior to the collapse of communism, you had people with various views. Some people who took very extreme views against the Moscow Patriarchate, some who did not. But the Synod as a whole never condemned the Moscow Patriarchate. We never said they're graceless heretics or anything like that. And the reverse is also true. The Moscow Patriarchate never condemned ROCOR. And actually, in the 1990s, if they had chosen to condemn ROCOR as schismatics, I think most of the rest of the Orthodox Church would have just assumed that that was a authoritative statement. So the fact that they didn't was showing that they wanted to reconcile. And also, we had always talked about that the day would come when we would reconcile. It's just that some people didn't agree whether that day had come or not. But those were basically the issues, and that was the moment when it started to change. And so when the closer we got to that, that's when these differences within ROCOR started to bubble to the surface. Because as long as the Soviets were in charge, we could all agree, hey, whatever you think about the Moscow Patriarchate, we can't come under them, because the Soviets would manipulate us through them. It was only after that things started, these differences started to come to the fore.
Now, before, and because we really need Father Joseph's insight on this, so I'm going to add one thing. I'm going to push back a tiny bit, and just on the nature of the Russian Church today, right, since the Ukraine war and everything, and just the realities of Putinist Russia. Are we sort of seeing like a sort of neo-Sergianism or crypto-Sergianism in Russia? Because what I have to say, knowing Moscow Patriarch priests, is if they got family in Russia, they will not dare say anything about any political policy in Russia because they're afraid of retaliation in Russia. And they're obviously not happy about it. And,
well, the thing is, you have to understand what Sergianism is and what it isn't.
Okay, so please explain.
Sergianism does not mean that the Orthodox Church cooperates with the government on some level, or that it might not even be manipulated in some way by the government. What Sergianism is defending or lying about the persecution of the church by the state, and cooperating with it on some level in a way that facilitates that persecution. And I think in some of the criticism towards the Moscow Patriarchate, beginning with Metropolitan Sergius, I think was not entirely fair. But certainly there were times when they just openly lied about what was going on in Russia. They would say that there's no persecution of the church in Russia or in the Soviet Union. Well, that was a lie, and that was wrong. And in the year 2000, the Russian church, in their statement about the relationship between church and state, said that you can't lie about that kind of stuff, and you certainly can't cooperate with the government in a way that facilitates persecution.
Thank you, Father John. Now, on purpose, because I know Father Joseph is ready to pounce on so many different things, I'm purposely going to reverse ask the same question back so we can then kind of cover all the same ground over again from your perspective, Father Joseph. Did the 2007 agreement between ROCOR and Moscow Patriarchate invalidate earlier synodical actions such as the 1983 condemnation of ecumenism?
Well, I'm going to have to go on this from a couple of different levels because there were a couple of things that I need to address in the previous statement. But the first one would be yes.
But first, please answer the question.
Right.
But
that's what I'm going to do. In the first place, yes. This is part of the reason why we have the video depositions of Bishop, now Archbishop Gabriel, for example, saying that the anathema against ecumenism was no longer valid. There's other issues at play there.
And to define Gabriel and ROCOR.
Correct. That's on YouTube. That's not. I'm not making that up.
Well, we still read that anathema from the Synodicon on the Sunday of Orthodoxy,
and a lot of people
which is also true. Yes,
but in my church, the reason I'm bringing this up is not to kind of do a gotcha on Father John. It's because of the fact that at that time, I'm simply trying to point out that contemporary authorities, not all of them obviously, but some of them, understood that particular line about everything in disagreement being null and void as to be literally null and void. So I'm not saying that was a universal. I do recognize that just a few years later, you saw the anathema against ecumenism, the second anathema, and all the other things on the Jordan Will website. I'm the first to admit that. But what I would say is that the question of whether they considered it binding had changed somewhat. To go a little bit further, I agree with Father John's definition of Sergianism, except I would add that it's not simply lying, but it comes down to submission to Antichrist governments. And what I mean by that is either Antichrist submissions or submission to Antichrist governments. But the whole point is that you're talking about submission to evil in a way a Christian cannot do by conscience. And so, yes, Sergius did lie about the situation of the church out when he was outside Russia. But inside Russia, he was also assisting in the facilitation of the imprisonment and torture of Orthodox Christians. The most famous case I remember is that of Ivan M. Andreev, who was part of the St. Petersburg delegation that met with Sergius when they were asking what could be done to stop the persecutions, and he literally looked at the face of people suffering in the face of the Soviets and said, what persecutions are there here? So the point is, it's not even just dishonesty to the rest of the world. He was a traitor to his own people, his own Orthodox people. And so that's, I think, where I'd go with that for now. But just if you want to follow up.
And so to review, it sounds like you agree that the definition of Sergianism that Father John gave is correct. You agree that in 2007 explicitly did not invalidate what the anathema of 1983, but due to certain bishops believing it did as such, it kind of leaves that an open question. Is that an accurate way of understanding?
I would say that what it means is that the answer given that the 2007 statement was only referring to things like depositions, etc., because we're contemporaries of the period, was not the way people as a whole understood it. Maybe some did, but other people understood it as the anathema against ecumenism is no more. And I will add that there were people who were actually celebrating that.
I don't
Now,
know
let
of
me ask.
anybody.
Okay.
I don't remember anybody talking about, hey, we're going to the Moscow Patriarchate, and this means that we're invalidating the anathema against ecumenism. I
Let me
don't think
ask you.
anybody saw that as a change of our stance on ecumenism.
Well, I mean, I remember when Bishop Jerome, and I don't want to sound like I'm jumping here, but remember he was Father John Shaw back then in the days with all those email lists, and he loved saying Father Panteleimon authored the anathema against ecumenism. It was never really the Russian bishop. Do you remember that?
Well, that Bishop Jerome has always said that, and he continues to say that. But the thing is, his point is he didn't believe that it actually was part of the original minutes of that meeting. But the thing is, whether
So
it really was or not, it certainly was used in the Synopticon of Orthodoxy after that. So
Yeah.
it really doesn't
Well, yeah,
matter how it came into being.
let's talk
It
about
was
that.
being affirmed. But the thing is, it's still being affirmed. If we believe that our going into communion with the Moscow Patriarchate ended that, we wouldn't continue to say it.
It's I'll say it on a personal note. I've met Bishop Jerome because he's actually the Hermitage of the Lady of Kursk in Mayapack, New York. I grew up in Mayapack, New York.
Oh,
So so it's just one of those random things. I actually met Bishop Jerome there going to a Saturday liturgy. But that being said, it's we see this claim here. Compare the anathema they read today to the anathema in 1983. I'm inferring that is the anathema has been changed.
it was, in the 2000s.
Is there some intentional change, or is there some confusion as to what was published, what wasn't? What are we really dealing with here? Let me give you both guys a opportunity to respond to this.
If there is a change, it's a very subtle one. It doesn't really change the substance of it. I wasn't aware that there was any difference in the wording.
And Father Joseph, what kind of difference is there then?
Okay, well, first off, I'm going to explain what was the change in a generality, and then I'll explain how it was presented by different people. The change occurred, I believe, I want to say around 2002 to 2003. It was right after the Schism of Metropolitan Vitaly. It was done at Synod headquarters, and basically it changed the anathema from one that was relatively short to one that was about 2 paragraphs long. It added things like Freemasonry, so on and so forth. So it was originally pitched as, and nobody understood why, and until you took it apart, pitched as something positive, that we were anathematizing all sorts of ecumenists, we were anathematizing the syncretists and the Masons, so on and so forth. But it wasn't until I did this, and apparently I wasn't the first person to do this, started comparing them side by side. The one thing that the anathema of 1983, which is shorter, contains, that the anathema of 2002 or 2003 doesn't contain, is or those who participate with them. Like, that's gone in the second one. So in theory, the second anathema actually, while it is broader, actually does not condemn those who can celebrate with, say, ecumenists. So it's actually more useful that way. But again,
so the argument is the change that was made was deliberate, so that way they could kind of have their cake and eat it too. They could say we're against the we're against the ecumenists, but we're not going to condemn those that are not against the ecumenists, something like that.
Exactly. Right, but it was because they added so much stuff to it, it was a very subtle bait and switch. Even HTM in their analysis of it didn't notice it. So, but it's not until you look at it side by side and you realize that.
I'll say 2 comments on this. One, I'll pay special careful attention in the Synopticon this year during Lent. And the second thing is, even I will say, historically speaking, with things like even the Constantinopolitan Creed, we do find subtle manuscript differences where eventually a given textual variant gets precedent, and that's what we know as the creed. I have no idea if there's something like this here. It's an interesting historical question.
Oh no,
anyway.
This isn't a textual variant. This was an actual official change. If you look at Jordan,
okay, so it's a deliberate change in 2003.
It's an official change. Yeah.
Okay.
That's not an act. That's not a
well.
mistake.
The thing I would say about that though is if Father Joseph is suggesting that the original canon or the original anathema had the sort of cootie view of an anathema, where if you are anathema, then anybody that you are serving with gets the cooties, and then anyone they serve with gets the cooties. That's a wrong way of understanding anathemas and canonical penalties anyway. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain specifically says that an anathema has to be directed at somebody specifically to be effective. Otherwise, it's a warning. And the original anathema was not. It didn't pin the tail on the heretic. It just said, if you do this, anathema. But that's a warning when you don't say so and so did this and he's anathema. Those are two very different statements.
Well, okay, first off, I do want to clarify, Father, with all due respect. I was not trying to imply that one anathema was better than the other. I was simply noting the differences between the texts.
Okay.
On a second point, I would say that while, yes, one could argue this cootie thing, I guess you're saying, but the idea that co-laborers with heretics weren't condemned, you find that in the Third Ecumenical Council, you find that in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. People who worked with Vigilius were anathematized, people who worked with Nestorius were anathematized. I mean, co-workers of heretics have often been labeled as heretics.
Well, when you say co-workers of heretics, that would be people who are actually promoting the heresy, whereas when you're talking about people who remain in communion with somebody, most of the Orthodox Church remained in communion with Rome after 1054 for a century or two before they actually broke communion. And you have a lot of examples like this where some people broke communion with a particular group, but other people did not. And I'm not aware of any case where the church said, because you remained in communion with this group after such and such date, you're therefore condemned. It was always based on what you taught.
Well, I mean, I tend to think, well, when we're talking about the Rome example, it gets a little bit complicated because of the fact that there were times in different sees where they didn't know if another bishop was alive. They would commemorate a bishop 20 years after his death. But in the case of Rome, the change was so radical, and I think Craig covers the whole basics of that in his latest book. But ultimately, with Hildebrand, you have a civil war occurring throughout Western Europe. Most of the Eastern Church had no idea what was going on, and they were just like, okay, who's the Pope? But they didn't even commemorate him or not. They just stopped around 1014 because they stopped keeping track for some reason, and by the time they started again, that's when we get to
well, we're getting a little off topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, and for what it's worth, like even with the Filioque, that was sent in a Sesastic letter in 1009, I think it was, and Constantinople excommunicated Rome, but Antioch didn't. And in fact, Antioch actually made note of that in their letter in around 1054, when this excommunication became more relevant due to the famous things happening then. But that's a whole other really interesting question and a little beyond us at the moment. Now, let me ask an interesting question, because I've asked this several times. I get different answers. So I'm going to pose it to you first, Father John, and then to Father Joseph. Was ROCOR ever completely walled off from world orthodoxy, or did they have tangential communion with jurisdictions such as Serbia and Jerusalem the whole time?
We had communion with both churches the whole time. I served with the local Serbian parish on many occasions long before we reconciled with the Moscow Patriarchate. And in Jerusalem, our churches were celebrating the liturgy on the Jerusalem Patriarchal Antimencia. So they never stopped commemorating the Patriarch of Jerusalem because they were guests in his canonical territory. So, I mean, you had some people who thought we should go all the way and cut everybody off, to be sure, but that was not what the majority of the bishops were in favor of doing.
Now, let me pose that same question to Father Joseph. How about the True Orthodox? Were they ever, perhaps until maybe the year 2000, and you could talk about that, completely walled off from the rest of world orthodoxy?
Well, oh boy, this is where we're going to have a whole lot of stuff to cover here, and
let me start here, and forgive me if you feel like I'm interrupting.
No, please.
So with the Serbians, with that's what Father John's relating, you concur with this, correct? With at least ROCOR.
No, the Serbian situation
then please
was,
explain.
And a lot of people don't know this stuff. This is really kind of really detailed history. But in Serbia, during the time where ROCOR, as the Karlovci Synod, was there, Serbia recognized and celebrated with ROCOR. After they left, and after World War II, once basically a Soviet government had established itself in Serbia, there was a period where the Serbian church, remember that chaos I talked about in the 20s to 40s with Greece and Russia and Bulgaria and Romania, had now spread to Serbia. And so you had separations going on in Serbia where Patriarch Roman was considered a collaborationist. And there was a statement by ROCOR, I believe in 1945 or 53, where they said we're cutting off communion with Serbia currently because of the situation with the Patriarch. And St. Justin of Kelije, for example, St. Justin Popovic, he broke communion with the Patriarch as well at the end of his life. So, and then you had the Free Serbs in America, which... the point is, it is not an easy history. With Patriarch Pavel, it's sort of normalized, but
to simplify this, ROCOR was in communion with some Serbs, not others?
Correct. Well, sometimes. Depends on the time.
And sometimes then.
Well, I'd be interested to see the statement where ROCOR broke communion with the Serbs.
I can try to
because
find
I
it
know
if you want it.
my own archbishop went to Serbia in the 70s and got a degree from Belgrade University, I believe. And I've never gotten any indication that he wasn't celebrating with them or receiving communion from them while he was there. And as far as the Free Serbs are concerned, I think that a lot of people in ROCOR had some sympathy for the Free Serbs, but they also didn't see the Free Serb situation as being analogous to ours. And so I don't know of any celebration with them. There might have been some that I don't know about, but it's not like we recognize them and not the patriarchal Serbian church.
Right. I would say that you are correct there, Father. I don't remember that the Free Serbs were, especially at that period, were ever in communion with ROCOR. But at that point, ROCOR was not in communion with any Serbs. But it just depended on the time.
Well, maybe unpacking the same question with the Jerusalem Patriarchate may also bring some light to the Serbian question, because what Father John's bringing out is, or make it worse, because what Father John's bringing out is from personal experience, right? His whole career as a clergyman, that was never an issue, wasn't an issue for his bishop. I hear the same thing from other ROCOR clergymen about Jerusalem. We've had, Father Joseph, you and I, a good conversation about Jerusalem. So let me frame it this way with you. How official or unofficial was communion between ROCOR and any other True Orthodox jurisdiction with Jerusalem? If you could maybe unpack some of that for us.
Jerusalem is a very, being the center of the Orthodox world is a very, very difficult subject. And I think Father John would agree, because he did live through some of this. I know this because I came in and he was a deacon when I came in. And that occurred. I came in literally as the MP took over Hebron violently using the Palestinian police. So the point is that the Jerusalem Patriarchate officially in, I believe it was the visit of Patriarch Alexis in 1941, he officially demanded that the ROCOR not be allowed to celebrate in Jerusalem properties. And so formally, Jerusalem was like, okay, we're going to separate from the ROCOR. However, they were also aware that there were a great number of ROCOR properties, Russian Ecclesiastical Mission properties, because the Russian Ecclesiastical Mission was originally an arm of the Tsar. And so when the Tsardom fell, the REM, I guess I'll just call it real quick, was kind of, they deferred to ROCOR. But then the MP made its own REM, and so they kind of had their own property. So literally, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem was kind of trying to walk a tightrope line, like with this kind of Russian turf war. And this eventually would occur with the Greeks as well. So in the 1970s...
And you're saying, just to clarify, that's New Calendar and True Orthodox Greeks.
That is correct. So in the 1970s and 1980s even, you would have a True Orthodox priest in Jerusalem, a Greek priest celebrating on a Monday, a ROCOR priest celebrating on a Tuesday, an MP priest celebrating on a Wednesday, a New Calendar Greek priest celebrating on a Thursday, and they were all on Jerusalem Antimencia. Although I think the MP were allowed to use their own, but everyone else had to use Jerusalem's Antimencia, to my knowledge.
Now, now you guys are priests, so you take this stuff for granted. But for the audience, the antimons, you need those in order to do a liturgy. The relic is in it,
Right.
and it's given to you by a bishop, and it's essentially a sort of communion, right? Like you're not going to give the antimons to a Roman Catholic or to an Anglican or something like that.
You could kind of think of it in a certain sense as a license to serve the liturgy, because if your bishop revokes your antimons, you don't have the right to serve the liturgy anymore. And
so I just wanted to bring that out simply because, you guys take it for granted, but for us laymen, the interested people on the internet, they're not going to know those tiny little details. And in fact, a lot of historians don't. They don't know these liturgical details. They'll try to answer historical questions where you need liturgical details. So, Father Joseph, please continue.
On that note, I would add that under normal circumstances, a priest uses his own antimencia. So, his own antimencian. So, the fact that a lot of people couldn't in Jerusalem meant that there was kind of a questionable, situation. So they were like, just use ours. You're our guest. So it was a bit more complex than that. And that's not just complicated with ROCOR history, it's complicated with True Orthodox history as well. While the Synod of Chrysostomos Chiusis kept in fairly good touch with Jerusalem, many of the other groups, including that of Archbishop Maxentius, did not. But at least in the early days, the Archbishop Maxentius was aware of it, because there are cases, one of which, deals with the Synod with Bishop Chrysostomos Chiusis, of that sort of usage occurring in Jerusalem.
Well, now let me cut in the middle here, and maybe both sides agree. Receiving antimons from the Jerusalem Patriarchate, at some level, that's like a license. I'm giving you a driver's license to drive here. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Right. And one thing I would say real quick is, when you're in an area like the United States where there isn't an established, universally recognized local Orthodox church,
he's right.
Different local churches use their own antimencia and they don't bat an eye. But in Jerusalem, our parishes or monasteries had to have, and I think prior to the revolution always had, Jerusalem patriarchal antimencia, because they're serving there with the blessing of the patriarch, and they had to commemorate the patriarch.
All right, and so then both sides here agree. Fathers do agree that with these antimons, they were commemorating the patriarch that granted the antimon. But this was, just to make clear, because a lot of the audience may not know, this is also true with Greek True Orthodox, not just ROCOR.
That's correct. Not all Greeks, but it was true with many of them.
With some, because again, there's a lot of True Orthodox. Now, let me go one step further. At what level were there celebrations between clergy and with, let's say, episcopacy? So were there? I've heard the ROCOR nuns being able to to commune with another bishop. I mean, at what level did concelebration go all the way up to the episcopal level? And so both sides. How about you first, Father Joseph?
You mean concelebrations between ROCOR and the True Orthodox?
Well, no. Well, first let's start. How about ROCOR or True Orthodox with Jerusalem?
I'll tell you, those are going to be fewer incidents, because it's not very often that the bishops were doing concelebrations with regular priests. Most of these services that were being done were just basic services for the people, because unlike I hate to say it, a lot of the rest of the world, in Jerusalem, they had a lot more daily services. So that opportunity arose without necessarily big need for concelebration or anything like that. To my knowledge, there have been a few cases, but not many.
Okay. Father John, do you have any comments on, because I read one comment by a ROCOR clergyman where he's saying the bishops were concelebrating in Jerusalem. I don't know if you have any insight.
I'm sure that happened. Exactly how often it happened, over what period of time, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But ROCOR always had very close relations with the Jerusalem Patriarchate, and they really had no choice but to maintain those relationships, because they would have lost all their property in the Holy Land had they not maintained those relationships.
Now, let me pose this to both of you. It's been posed to me that, in a sense, they're like the tightrope that Father Joseph was talking about. that when the Jerusalem Patriarchate entered into communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, clearly that is a can't pronounce words. It delegitimizes ROCOR, and so that the ROCOR Synod in the 1940s didn't like this. But it doesn't seem like it went to such an official level where they would, let's say, condemn the Jerusalem Patriarchate for the reasons you just discussed. So was this almost a sort of communion gray area is the most accurate way to put it, where they're receiving anathemas, they don't want to endorse the Jerusalem Patriarchate because that'd be a backhanded way of endorsing the Moscow Patriarchate? Is this what we're dealing with here?
Who are you asking? Me?
Let's Father John. Why not?
Well, I'm not aware of the Jerusalem Patriarchate ever saying we're breaking communion with ROCOR or anything like that that was condemnatory. My understanding of what happened with the properties in the Holy Land is that when Israel became a state that was established by the United Nations, the Soviet Union played some role in facilitating that, along with the United States, of course. And Israel had very good relations with the Soviet Union. And so before the West Bank and Gaza were incorporated into the state of Israel, the Soviets were able to use that leverage to basically take those properties. I mean, the Israeli authorities took those properties and handed them over to the Moscow Patriarchate. But that did not affect the properties we had. I don't know if we had anything in Gaza, but we certainly had a lot of properties in the West Bank and in the west side of Jerusalem. So we have two convents that are on the Mount of Olives, for example. But at the time that this happened, where the other properties that was in Israel proper were transferred, these properties were beyond their reach. And then when they eventually did occupy the West Bank, the Israelis were no longer feeling inclined to hand those properties over. So that's how we were able to keep them.
Okay, and so interrupt because I know the audience is not too interested in every single property dispute. Father Joseph, would you have anything to add, just broadly speaking, that there was no official condemnation or no official acceptance? There was just kind of this somewhat official, not fully official acceptance on the side that the fact that they're just serving the same anthems and irregularly celebrating with one another.
Well, no, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with that on paper, but in terms of the kind of the motivation, no. What the paper I'm looking at? Give me just a moment here. Was let me see here.
I'm gonna bring this up from Evangelos, great genius on the issue of Saint Dionysius and many other things. He points out that the Patriarch Diodorus of Jerusalem tried to enter into communion with the Old Calendars Greeks in the early 90s, and Archbishop Yavakos of America and Patriarch Bartholomew. I mean,
that's a misrepresentation.
You're shaking your head no. What are your comments on this, Father Joseph?
That's a complete misrepresentation. That's World Orthodox bizarro world. That's like, oh, we tried to enter into communion with the Old Calendar. They were already there. They were there for like 2-3 decades. Now Patriarch Diodorus is famous because of the fact that he showed a great deal of support and even had celebrations with members of the Synod and Resistance, for which he paid dearly at the hands of Patriarch Bartholomew, who pushed for his synod to have him deposed and make his life miserable. But no, it's just not a realistic statement at all.
Well, okay, so the tenor of the statement you don't agree with, but
no, because it implies magnanimity on the part of the new calendars who don't deserve it.
All right, I guess because I think you're fighting the wrong guy here. It's okay to fight, but I think that the point being made here is that it sounds to me, right? It sounds to me. This speaking material facts and not dealing with what the ramification of these facts are, is that ROCOR had some level, I'm just going to leave it at that, of communion with World Orthodox due to the situation in Jerusalem. But this would include certain Greek True Orthodox as well up into the 90s, maybe up to the year 2000. That seems to be the material facts. Is there anything either of you would like to dispute about that basic statement? All right, it seems like we. All right,
no, I can go. I can go. I was just waiting for him
all right, Father John.
Well, basically, there were good relations with old calendar groups that existed prior to 1996, but the initial attempt at being into full communion did not last very long because of the disunity among the Greek Old Calendarists. And I'm not aware of any like Episcopal concelebrations per se that would have happened in the meantime, or even concelebrations on the clerical level, although they may have happened.
Well, let me pose to you this point, because it pertained to a comment you made about celebrating with the Serbians when in the 90s and before 2008, where this commenter says, my priest was in ROCOR, and he said you could celebrate with the priest, the Serbian priest, but not the hierarch. So you give us like a...
Well, I served with Metropolitan Christopher on more than one occasion. He was,
right, well, so,
he was quite the character, so it's vivid in my memory.
So are you saying, Father, that this random person, anonymous person, is less trustworthy?
Well, he may have been told that, but I'm just telling you, I can celebrate it with a Serbian bishop on several occasions before we reconcile with the Moscow Patriarchy.
And with the blessing of your bishop, obviously.
Yeah.
Because you don't just do that drop of a hat.
Yeah, you don't can celebrate with a clergyman of another jurisdiction without the blessing of your bishop unless you want to get a good slap on the head.
Anything in Orthodoxy when it comes to that stuff is like putting together a rocket launch. There's a lot of checks that happen before these things occur.
Right.
Let me put this up where it says Father John's archbishop wasn't supposed to be going to Serbia to learn. The synod ROCOR had a prohibition that their clergy traveling communist countries. Is this disinformation? Do you have any comments on that? Is it true?
Well, it's not true, because clergymen traveled to the communist countries on a somewhat regular basis. As a matter of fact, before the Cold War ended, the CIA was often asking for information from our clergy, and we had very good relations with the CIA at that time too. I think they even sent money to the Synod of Bishops, as I understand it, prior to the end of the Cold War. And I think that our clergy did that with a clear conscience, because they were very anti-communist, and they felt like helping out the United States and in its opposition to the Soviet Union was a good thing.
We were fighting over who had more feds before. We have this.
Well, the feds lost interest in us until we started talking to the Moscow Patriarchate, and then all of a sudden they remembered that we might be useful in the future.
There you go.
So that's a whole nother story.
Both you guys, St. John Maximovich can celebrate the new calendar and ROCOR stricter days. True, not true?
He can celebrate with new calendarists, and matter of fact, he oversaw I think the French Orthodox Church was on the new calendar, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe those things are together. Those were the new calendars he could celebrate it with.
But there was a Romanian new calendar diocese in ROCOR, and there was also a Bulgarian new calendar diocese.
But
so even when the ROCOR bishops got together, he was celebrating with new calendar bishops.
But not necessarily with like rest of world Orthodox.
Oh, I think he was. I'm pretty sure that he did. I know that we had pretty good relations with the Greek Archdiocese up until really the 70s. That's when things started to go in a different direction.
Father Joseph, just on that one point, concur, don't concur?
Well, I would say that it is it's an oversimplification to say that the ROCOR in the United States had great relations with the Greek Archdiocese. I mean, all of the parishes that formed Hakhna were previously Greek Archdiocese before they all joined ROCOR. But so I mean, it's the famous letters between Father Alexander Schmemann and Father Michael Oskul were perfect examples of kind of the low level of esteem that these parties held each other, these parties held each other. It's kind of I don't want to say that it. That's kind of the problem when we're talking about these things, is that the history is messy, and the tendency, like when we talk about world orthodoxy, we forget that this is a term that was invented by Father John Meyerndorf in like 1973. Father Seraphim notes that in his letters. Before that, it was just whoever claimed to be Orthodox was Orthodox. And then you had to investigate them personally, or you had to know about where they came from. In the 1970s, the New Calendar Greek Church its archbishop, I think it was in 73, made a statement to the synod talking about how the entire synod's makeup was uncanonical and how they all knew it. So the idea that there was like this unified monolith is simply a lie, and I don't think we should continue defending it, especially in ROCOR, because when we were talking about Jerusalem in 1941, as I mentioned, Patriarch Alexei showed up. In 1945, the Jerusalem Patriarchate officially stopped recognizing ROCOR, and this is coming from
Patriarch Alexei couldn't have been in Jerusalem in 1941 because he wasn't elected patriarch until 1945 or 46.
Well, let me see here, because what I'm looking at is this was actually this was a, what's the word I'm looking for? It was a theology doctorate.
Well, as you're looking that up, I'm gonna frame this question because it's actually going to cover what we're trying to answer
the
here.
point is it was a doctorate in Moscow, but I'll get into it. But okay.
Now, so I'm going to pose this to Father John, and then Father Joe's going to be able to respond. How do we respond to several primary sources indicating that ROCOR was not in communion with these other jurisdictions? There's a statement from Father Seraphim Rose that ROCOR was not in communion with the rest of the world's churches. There's allegedly a 2000 Jordanville publication saying the same, and a Moscow Patriarchy dissertation due to breakdowns in relations since the 1940s.
I think that's the paper I'm referencing.
Yeah, so like, would you say, Father John, this is would be interpreting the sources too categorically, and there was intercommunion, or is there disinformation and there really wasn't intercommunion, or was the intercommunion very infrequent? How do we make sense of all these documents and all these competing claims?
Well, Father Seraphim Rose's statement would have dated probably from the 70s, and the thing is after the lifting of the anathemas, there was definitely a chilling of relations between ROCOR and other jurisdictions. And, I came into ROCOR in 1990, and I was aware of that, but I also knew that it wasn't like a formal schism per se, because, for example, the priest that baptized me had been ordained by Metropolitan Philip of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and when he asked for a release to ROCOR, Metropolitan Philip gave him a release. And whenever he came to Oklahoma City, he always wanted Father Anthony to come by and see him. He had very cordial relations with him. So, it wasn't like we were saying those people are heretics. But, for example, when I was considering where to go to seminary, it never occurred to me that St. Tikhon's Seminary was a possibility because I knew our relations with the OCA were not great. So basically, Jordanville was the only option that I was able to consider. Hold on.
Yeah, your volume dropped, Father.
Yeah, my wife was calling me.
It's back.
Yeah. So, Father Joseph, same question. It sounds like you concur with Father John that there was never a complete walling off of ROCOR at any juncture.
Well, I mean, unless I was to actually stare at the breakdown of the years, my guess would be that when there was, it would have been between the late 1940s to mid 1970s. But it was intermittent, dependent on situations. And this was also true of True Orthodox Greeks. It was true of a lot of people.
I'm not sure where you're getting from the 1940s that this was going on, because, for example, Metropolitan Anthony Bashir of the Antiochian Archdiocese was consecrated with the help of Archbishop Vitali of New Jersey. And, so these relationships remained fairly normal up until the 70s. It was the lifting of the anathemas that caused things to change dramatically.
Well, again, remember how I noted that this was something we have when we look at the world, everything gets more chaotic. You mentioned Archbishop Anthony Bashir, but at the same time, at that time, Antioch in America was divided into two different dioceses that didn't recognize each other. So, I mean, it's never as simple as
our relations with what became the OCA went south in about 1946 because we were part of the same jurisdiction, and then they separated from us. And actually, prior to the OCA receiving autocephaly from the Moscow Patriarchate, our churches were in communications and discussing reconciling. But basically, they got an offer from the Moscow Patriarchate and they took it, and that caused relationships to even get worse. But prior to that, they were not good.
Yeah, and a lot of people viewed that 1970 autocephaly as a betrayal because I think they traded off Japan for that because the Japan was under the Metropolia until then,
Right.
and so they kind of looked at it as like betraying the Japanese people to get a crown. So yeah, I know that there's a lot there is the point.
And just for the audience, the key takeaway is when we see, especially that we're not dealing with like synoptical territories that are just Russian or just Bulgarian, at least right now, we're talking about ROCOR. This would be different when we're talking about the old calendars in Romania, in Bulgaria, etc. That what you're dealing with situations constantly in flux, right? There's people there in communion with, there's people that they're not, and they're both Antiochians, they're both this, they're both that. This is constantly happening in the 20th century. So for those on the internet that want neat and tidy binary answers, where they in, where they out, you don't quite get that because of this throughout the 20th century. There's almost a fog of war around the constantly changing situation.
That's how St. Basil described the Meletian schism, the fog of war.
See, I think I make it very simple though in this book, but that's a different topic. Let me ask this. It seems like now everyone dislikes them on all sides. Poor guys. Whatever happened to ROAC, the catacomb church? Like, I mean, ROCOR did recognize them, and then now they're not recognized. Like, no one likes them. So can I just get some insight from both of you? Father Joseph, what's the deal with the catacomb church today and in recent memory?
Okay, first off, ROAC was
Russia.
Right. It was never completely the catacomb church. That's not correct. Most of ROAC are legal, public Russian Orthodox communities that are under bishops. They did up until, and I think there is a bishop or an arch who takes care of them now, but before that, they had two bishops, Archbishop Anthony and Seraphim, who took care of catacomb communities that had applied to them over the decades. Now, keep in mind, and I want to make this clear, those two bishops and Metropolitan Valentine's actions in assigning them because of their own history with the catacomnics was an attempt to undo the damage caused by Archbishop Lazar of Tambov. Because when Archbishop Lazar was made a secret bishop, he had catacomb relations. Some suspect it's because he was with the MP. Some suspect it was because he was just not a pleasant person. But the point is, he ended up going into catacomb communities as a ROCOR bishop and collapsing them, just telling them that they didn't have priesthood and they'd have to be redone. And so this caused chaos in the catacomb church, which Bishop and then later Metropolitan Valentine endeavored to fix. But to say that ROCOR is the catacomb church it's incomplete because there are other Russian jurisdictions. B, it's incorrect because most of ROAC's churches are public. But Metropolitan Valentine has since passed on, God rest his soul, and it's led by Bishop Theodore.
How about before 1989 they weren't public?
No one was public. The Iron Curtain was still down. Was still up. No one could know anything except.
And so, are they legitimately the continuation of any underground churches within the Soviet Union at that time?
Yeah, some of them, yes. Some of them, even though that was unfortunate that the reports that Lazar gave to the ROCOR Synod was that that's not the case at all. And it wouldn't be till a few years later that Archbishop Hilarion, that later Metropolitan Hilarion of ROCOR, would say if we had listened to more people than maybe Bishop Lazar, we would have gotten a different result. But the point is that there were catacomnics. They survived all the way to the end of the Iron Curtain. There were not many, and many of them went in different directions. Some of them even joined the MP. I'm not going to deny that. But the point is that sort of dynamic existed because it was an illegal existence.
Now, do you have any comments you'd like to add on the same question, Father John?
Well, the thing about the catacomb church that has to be understood is that during the 20s and the 30s, the catacomb church was certainly a large group of people. But one thing about the catacomb church is as persecutions increased for the church that was above ground, the catacomb church would balloon but when the persecutions were slackened, they, a lot of people started going back to the above ground church. And really, after World War II, when you had the election of Patriarch Alexis the First, the bulk of the catacomb church basically merged back in with the Moscow Patriarchate. When ROCOR went in the 80s and started ordaining some secret bishops, it's notable that what they didn't do was enter into communion with the catacomb bishops, because there were none, at least none that we thought were legitimate. And the people we ordained were invariably people who had belonged to the Moscow Patriarchate. And one thing that I think we started to learn as time went on is that they came to us and said, "Oh, I've been persecuted by the Moscow Patriarchate because I'm a defender of true orthodoxy and a bulwark against a modernism and ecumenism." It turned out that in many cases they were being disciplined because of their own bad behavior, and that bad behavior continued after they came into ROCOR. So I think that on the whole, I would say that our experiment with us trying to establish a free Russian church was not a very successful undertaking.
I would add that on these are two things that Father John is talking about.
Briefly,
really, very briefly. Bishop Lazar is, who I was referring to when we were talking about ROCOR moving into Russia, and the people that were of loose character I've talked to you about, Craig, in terms of Vicente Chekolin, etc., who was, that was the case in the ROCOR. What I will say is that despite that, the True Orthodox in Russia are actually thriving and in the millions, even though they are in separate and disparate groups. And so I just wanted to add that so that it wasn't, I don't want to give the impression that they didn't exist, because they did.
All right. So let me.
I would have to see the evidence of those numbers to believe it. I'm sure there is groups with some numbers, but I'd say there's probably more old believers in Russia than there are true Orthodox believers.
Well, that's if Solzhenitsyn was right. I don't think he was.
Now, let me ask this question to Father John. Is ROCOR in 2024 not the same ROCOR of 2007? And what I mean is, would they even want communion? Do we even want communion with the True Orthodox in this juncture? So let me ask that question just straight out. Is that offer on the table 2007, that offer wouldn't be there anymore, right?
Well, we wouldn't be able to do anything unilaterally on that score, but one thing anybody who's watched me when I've been on shows where I've been talking to people about issues related to things like ecumenism, when I'm talking to someone who's trying to defend ecumenism, you will see that I invariably say, "Why are you talking with these heretics when you're not bothering to talk to the Greek old calendarists? And why don't you work on that one before you start moving on to other things?" Because I do think that that's something that should be taken seriously. I think that there's a lot of good people who got caught up in these groups, and I think it's unfortunate that they had reasons for it, but you could also find distinct parallels with the old believer schism. The old believers were right on quite a few of the points that wound up resulting in the schism, and they definitely were persecuted by the Russian government with the collaboration, you could say, of the Russian Church, and at least some of the bishops anyway, and that's all not good. Those are bad things. But if you look at the saints from Russia post that schism, what you don't find them saying is that the old believers are right, let's go with them. So I think that the fact that there are reasons why people wind up going into schism doesn't necessarily mean that that's justifiable canonically. But I do think that it's incumbent upon all Orthodox to want to seek to reconcile with people who have Orthodox faith. Even if we don't agree with them on every issue, we should talk about what it is that separates us. And at the end of the day, we might find that we can't come to a reconciliation, but we ought to at least make the effort. And that ought to be a lot higher on the priority than talking with Pope Frank, the hippie Pope. You know, I don't think we're getting anywhere with him, but I think that we might get somewhere with these folks, because we at least, for the most part, share a common faith.
Now, let me ask a similar question to Father Joseph. Are the True Orthodox 2007 the same as 2024? Are they just as resistant to enter communion with ROCOR as they are today, as they would have been in 2007?
It's a harder question. And this is, again, it's kind of like,
obviously you're speaking for more people, but yeah, as best
but,
as you can answer.
But more importantly, and this is one of the things that, I mean, it's weird, because having lived in kind of, ROCOR was basically kind of almost, in some ways, at least at that time, a bridge between what we would call world Orthodoxy and True Orthodoxy. It kind of stood in the middle. And so I have been for so long in True Orthodox world that for me, it's more of a question of a system of regularization. How the church in Greece, for example, is reorganizing. The different jurisdictions are trying to sometimes work together in Greece and in Russia. And basically, we're looking at a period of rebuilding. In some ways, it's reminiscent of, say, the 1850s. In the 1850s, there were approximately 361 Orthodox bishops throughout the world. 90% of, well, I'd say more than half of what we would call patriarchates today did not exist in 1850. So that, from our perspective, we're kind of looking at it in terms of just rebuilding life. And that's kind of where I think Bishop Gregory Grabe is a very good example of this, in that he was very optimistic that the Soviets would fall, even in the 1940s. But when they did, he was always of the school that it would be time to go back and rebuild. So even though he did leave ROCOR and the mistreatment of his son, etc., we're not going to debate about that, whether it was mistreatment or not, he ended up going to ROAC. It was for him a natural consequence that he would die in Russia rebuilding the church. So from our perspective, no, it's not the same as it was 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, every jurisdiction was saying we're the only True Orthodox. And that's a perfectly good excuse in the face of persecution and when you don't have the era of mass communication. And that's part of the reason why, for example, like Metropolitan Theodore, the ROAC did not recognize, for example, Metropolitan Raphael's group, who came from the Seraphimo-Genedites and the Initiative Council of 1990. But it was only like 4 or 5 years ago that our Metropolitan Seraphim, were in communion with him, called up Metropolitan Theodore and said, look, what's wrong? We'll try to fix what's wrong. And that's what we have to do when we kind of do these things. We know what's wrong with the new calendar is they need to stop ecumenism and get off the new calendar. But it seems that when we haven't even touched on the persecutions of the True Orthodox in all these countries, but they can't even accept that those happened. If they can't even accept that those happened, we're at a communication impasse that's so far out that it's hard to reach them. And as Father John pointed out, they seem to be far more interested in talking with Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims. So, unfortunately, that is the thing. Also, one thing, Father John, no, most of the old believers were heretics. That's my view. That's the traditional view. A lot of them were weirdos. I'm not going to.
All right, well, we're going to debate that now, but let me ask this question. Was the Moscow Patriarchate, because I read a ROCOR article on this from 2006, claiming that the Moscow Patriarchate was always under the anathema of St. Tikhon. Do either of you agree with that?
I don't.
All right, so Father John doesn't, Father Joseph.
When you say the anathema of St. Tikhon, I assume you're referring to the one towards the Living Church. I would say that to some degree it does. And that is
so yes and no then.
Well, officially I would say it does. I can't speak for every person in the Moscow Patriarchate, but I can say that, for example, the Living Church Like
But
when they took over,
but you
when
have to
they took
remember,
over,
right? This is being applied to the Moscow Patriarchate every single decade up to 2006. So that's how we'd
yeah,
have to take that claim.
right.
And somebody
And
say
many
that's too
people,
much.
well, no, many people in ROCOR did take that position. Now, I'm not in the Russian church now, so I feel uncomfortable speaking for them.
Okay.
But the point is, I do know that many, when I was there, among the true Russian Orthodox, took that position.
Well, let me ask this spicy question, you, Father Joseph.
Oh,
Can the Sergian Synod be valid? Not good. That's not the argument. But right, the bishops succeeding from Patriarch Sergius
yeah.
and his synod, could they have valid orders and everything?
My inclination would be to say no. And the reason for that is because of the fact that the 1943 creation of the Patriarchate by Stalin is kind of where Sergianism really comes from, in the sense that it became full collaboration with the state and persecution of other Orthodox Christians.
Now,
I don't know how that becomes a synod.
So no judgment zone. I'm not judging personally on this question, but to make clear, then that means all episcopal succession from that, which would mean pretty much the whole modern Russian hierarchy today, they don't have valid holy orders then, right? Is that your position?
I'd say that that's standard Orthodox ecclesiology. That's not just that's their position on us too. That's not. It's a given that if you believe someone's a schismatic body, they don't have orders.
And again, that's because the idea is not to judge. So for the audience, it shows that, let's say, the way the jurisdiction that Father Joseph represents would understand the ROCOR clergy would be different than how they'd understand Moscow Patriarch.
That's correct.
clergy. All right. So that, just to make that clear.
I would encourage people to read St. John of Shanghai's History of the Russian Orthodox Church Abroad, which is available on orthodoxinfo.com. And you'll find that he does not declare Patriarch or Metropolitan Sergius a heretic. He actually expresses a lot of sympathy for his position. And he never condemns the Moscow Patriarchate per se. As a matter of fact, at the end of World War II, he briefly started commemorating Patriarch Alexei I and defended his election. He also, at that time, apparently didn't think that the Russian Church Abroad was continuing to function. And when he found out that it was continuing to function, he stopped commemorating Patriarch Alexis I. But he clearly didn't think that they were all a bunch of heretics. And Metropolitan Philaret, which has been referred to as Saint Philaret, and I hope one day we'll see that being recognized
we already did it
universally. But he was ordained, I believe, as an archimandrite, and his father might have even been a bishop under the MP in China after the communists took over. And when he came into ROCOR, he was not reordained or anything like that. So nobody, I'm not aware of any bishop.
So there's certain chinks in the armor of saying that all those orders are invalid because they don't have ramifications on ROCOR.
But if I could counter, I would say on that that Father John is right. Metropolitan Philaret's father did eventually, he was a bishop in the Moscow Patriarchate. He actually wrote a letter advocating returning to Russia, and he did return, to the Soviet Union, and he did return to the Soviet Union and died like a month later under mysterious circumstances. But Metropolitan St. Philaret's position on St. John, on how he viewed the Moscow Patriarchate, he referred to St. John's position as incomprehensible. He couldn't figure out how St. John actually viewed the Moscow Patriarchate as having grace. He himself had a very negative personal opinion of the Moscow Patriarchate, referring to them in very harsh terms in his private letters. And so even the Sorrowful Epistle, which is probably the most measured stuff that he wrote on the matter, he refers to Patriarch Alexis as an unfortunate old man that we can't recognize as the head of the Russian Church.
All right, I'm like getting on a more positive note. What do we have to do to fix this schism, Father Joseph?
Between the ROCOR and the True Orthodox, or between everyone?
We're just sticking ROCOR and True Orthodox.
To be
Your
honest,
answer could be they have to leave Communion MP. I'm just interested in your answer.
that
What
would
has to done
probably
to
be
do
the answer. But I think that after 20 years of separation of the people who didn't want to do that and their reorganization into other ROCOR bodies would tell me that the people who are still in communion with Moscow at this point kind of like it. So I feel like it would be kind of, I mean, that would be the basics, but I don't think they'd want to do that.
And Father John, what do you think is necessary for this schism to be healed?
Well, first, let me just say something real quick about
Sure.
Metropolitan Philaret, and that's that he wrote a somewhat favorable article about an elder in the Moscow Patriarchate by the name of Elder Tavrian. And the people who later became Hochna, some of whom are now in the mainstream Greek Old Calendar group, condemned him at the time. And, you know, they hold him up as a banner of orthodoxy, but they condemned him basically and accused him of heresy. And there's an article in which he writes a defense of what he said. That's also on orthodoxinfo.com. I believe it's the response to the Elder Tavrian is the title or something like that. But basically what he said is that when we see anything positive in the Moscow Patriarchate, we should acknowledge it. And he certainly didn't say, well, they're a bunch of graceless heretics, but, you know, this guy was not a bad guy, but he's still a graceless heretic. What views he held privately are one thing, but the thing is while he was metropolitan, the Russian Church abroad never condemned the Moscow Patriarchate and said they were without grace. That was never the position of the church as a whole. Now, as far as what would need to happen, I think one thing that might wind up happening that could result in, and I don't think it's going to be like one big fell swoop, mind you, but I could see a lot of the old calendarist True Orthodox groups, as they call themselves, coming back into the fold in the wake of the likely schism with the Constantinople that is likely to hit the fan in 2025. And I think that in the wake of that, there's a lot of things that will start becoming more clarified, and it will probably be easier for people in those groups to come to terms. But you know, ultimately, it's one of those things where it requires goodwill on both sides and people making the effort. And if you compare it again with the old believer system, which I don't believe the old believers, particularly in the early days, were a bunch of heretics. Their faith was Orthodox.
Later on,
but they had a narrow view, and they were actually, I think, in most of the things that they were saying that they were being treated wrongly about, or the things they were standing for, they had a right to those positions. But nevertheless, because they got so focused on external things, they wound up in schism, and then later on, the Russian Church opened up the door, and basically they established what was known as they're called in Russian staroveri, which means old faith or old believers, but they established, the Russian Church under Catherine the Great established bishops for the Edinaveri, which means the one faith. So they were allowing the old rite to be served again, and many did come back into the church and into full communion, but many more did not. But you know, and one thing that Father Pieman Simon, who's the rector of the Erie parish, this old rite in Pennsylvania, he was at the 2006 Sabor, and his speech at that council was considered to be one of the more pivotal moments in that council. But he was talking about how the old believers kept moving the goalpost whenever the mainstream Russian church was trying to reconcile with them. They were always coming up with new reasons why they couldn't do it. And he was comparing that with some of the people who were opposing talking to the Moscow Patriarchate. I myself was at the All Diaspora Clergy Conference in 2006, where we first really started to discuss this. And I remember a priest from South America that got up and said, until there's a God-anointed czar on the throne, we cannot enter into communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, obviously, the Russian Church has no control over that question. But the thing is, I guarantee you that if there was a God-anointed czar on the throne, that people of that mindset would say he's not a God-anointed czar because he was anointed by the wrong bishop. So until he's anointed by our bishops, he's not a God-anointed czar. you can always find another reason why you can't reconcile with people. But when you look at church history, you don't get the cartoon cookie, black and white, cut and dried view that is often presented by people who justify their schism. There's a lot of mess in church history, and if for example the old calendar was heresy, and if the moment people embraced it, they were therefore no longer Orthodox, then that means the entire church ceased to exist, because everybody was in communion with these bishops, and even the old calendar bishops got their episcopacy from a ROCOR bishop who was New Calendar. And so they got the New Calendar cooties. If you have the cootie view of heresy and anathemas, but that's not how the church actually works. There is ambiguity. There are times when there's sort of the fog of war. Father Joseph mentioned the Meletian schism, and that's a very good example where you had saints on both sides of that schism that we venerate today. And so even saints can wind up on the wrong side of a question with other saints, and that doesn't mean that they're not holy people. It just means that they're still human and that they can be mistaken.
Now, Father Joseph, let me give you an opportunity to kind of give your closing thoughts on the question, and then I'll give you guys plugs and we'll do audience questions. So let me give you an opportunity to maybe give your last word on the subject.
Okay. First off, I didn't want to imply that the Indinoveri were not Orthodox. I was specifically referring to the Stanoveri that were kind of the ones that got into Killist ideas and things like that. I will say this. I agree 100% with Father John where we talk about things being complicated. Whereas I'm not going to touch the Tsar question. I just am not. I'm not in the Russian church. It's just not a thing for me anymore. That there needs to be a God-anointed authority somewhere, I'm cool with. I just, we all know the politics around Tsarism, etc. The point is that when it comes right down to it, there are complicated issues. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the question of whether the old calendar was a heresy. I have, even in the past year or so, where suddenly people are interested in talking about true orthodoxy, met people who said, well, you're an old calendarist and it's a pagan calendar, so you guys are pagans. Now, this would mean that the entire church up until 1920 was pagan. So the point is that it's not, for me, we just have to keep doing what we do. And this is the very nature of ROCOR, I think, is kind of indicative of orthodoxy in microcosm throughout history, whether we realize it or not. And what I mean by that is that even at its most weakened and desperate position, the church always has the ability to rebuild. And this is, ultimately why I would say that 2024 is different than 2007, is that people have been doing rebuilding. I have been in celebrations in Greece and in Russia where there have been hundreds, thousands of people who were committed to true orthodoxy. But the point is, when we talk about whether or not, how to reach out to, say, for example, the new calendarists, well, we know that they are not going to change. Some of them will say to the effect that they'd like to go on the old calendar, but you won't find that position among their bishops. Patriarch John condemned the old calendarists of Antioch like a week ago. And that's just because he's dealing with, true Orthodox in the Antioch region in Syria. They're everywhere now. And my background coming from where I am is to just say, well, we'll just keep building as we are. I'd like to believe in 2025, but Father John, you remember Father Alexei Young ages ago before he was Father Ambrose? Remember Florence 2000? He wrote that book. We've been through this before, so I'd rather just be like, we'll just wait. Eventually, things will go back to normal.
There's no way to know for sure how things are going to pan out, but I think that is one way I could see things coming together. But of course, God can bring things together in ways that we couldn't have imagined. So that's my hope.
Definitely convenient.
My comment is actually a piggyback off Father John, which is in 2025. I think sadly, tragically, there will be perhaps wheat being separated from chaff, and then I think that will clear heads on both sides as to where everyone stands.
God willing. If there isn't, what do we do?
Well, again, we're not looking for problems to fix another problem. I'm saying that these are the sort of things I suspect will happen over time, and if it's not 2025, it'll be other times. Because, just to speak of the dirty laundry in world orthodoxy, you have the issue of divorced clergy and the ecumenical patriarchy. You know, the communing of heterodox spouses. Things like this that are happening.
Deaconesses since 2004, and the state church agrees.
Well, that depends. We're not going there right now. So, but the point being is, right, so we have major issues, and where are the condemnations? Where's anything being done? And it's almost like, well, God will do something. And I think we're already starting to see where these sides are forming. And geopolitical machinations and different things are almost making these fait accompli, sadly. Now there's other issues, and it includes both their sides. The tangential communion, not the tangential communions, but the parallel communions all over the place. This is unheard of in Orthodox history. And it exists in the modern era. It plagues both of our churches, and it's, in my opinion, cause of half the problems by default. And so these are issues which are coming to a head, and when the problems get big enough, we start seeing solutions get formed out of necessity. And so I think that will clear things on both sides, because that problem plagues both sides. So anyway, that's my opinion. Let me give you both an opportunity to do plugs before we do audience questions. So Father John, what would you like to plug?
Well, I in terms of what we've been talking about, I just would again say that there have been a lot of things in the 20th century that have been very confusing. But what people have to understand is that you find times like this in church history. This is not something that has never happened before. And I think that in terms of ROCOR was doing what it thought was best at the time. And I think that it made some mistakes in retrospect. I think that our involvement with the Greek Old Calendar movement with the two occasions where we had a direct involvement in it, I don't think that it turned out very well. But as we've gone forward, I think we've come to realize. Well, one thing what I was meaning to get to on that one was, I remember back in reading things from the 1970s, you get the impression that a lot of people in ROCOR thought that being divisive and breaking up into new groups was something that was sort of a genetic flaw among the Greeks, but that Russians were immune to it. And it was really with the Valentine schism that people started to wake up to the fact that, hey, we could go the same way, where we're divided up into 100 different ROCOR groups if we don't do something. And the groups that separated from ROCOR, you find that's exactly what wound up happening with them, as they didn't just stay one whole group. They started breaking up into groups and then breaking up into groups. And the old calendar movements had the same thing. Now, they did recently have a big merger of a lot of old calendar groups that may continue to gain steam, but it may also be that they're going to wind up breaking back up because they get into some argument about some issue and they can't agree to it anymore. But the ROCOR came to realization that this was a danger, and we didn't want to keep going down that road. And that was one of the reasons why we were interested in talking to the Moscow Patriarchate. But they also addressed the issues that we had. And since then, I've not seen any reason to think that we made a mistake. I think the Russian church is very healthy. Now, the war in Ukraine has obviously caused some issues. But if you look at church history, the fact that bishops try not to offend politicians in the country that they're in is not something new. I mean, bishops have never gone out of their way to condemn their own government in a time of war. And that's true not just of the Orthodox, but that's true of just about any religious group on the planet. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, didn't condemn Great Britain because it was engage in the Opium Wars, for example. You know, they didn't say, hey, we can no longer commemorate the Queen because of what Britain's doing in China, even though that was obviously an immoral war. I can't think of any there are probably a few examples you could point to. It's in the last 2,000 years where Christian leaders have actually spoken out against their government, but that's by far the exception when it's a time of war.
Now, so Father John, on the note of plugs, I have your YouTube channel there. We have your blog. Anything else you'd like to plug?
Well, I mean, you see me on different shows. I don't have my own YouTube show, but I am, although it's on hiatus, I've been doing my series of videos about doing reader services. It's just I've been so busy that I'm had to put that on ice until summer. But this summer I'm going to continue working on that.
Yeah, please, audience, go to Father John's channel and subscribe so he can get 1,000 subscribers and do the live streams for his liturgies and stuff. I mean, do him a favor, please. So that'll be there for you. We have Father Joseph. What would you like to plug?
Well, I always plug the same thing. NFTU, whether it's my website, whether it's my channel, etc. You know, I would like to take a moment, you know, so if you get a chance, nftu.net, or you can follow our YouTube channel. I assume it might be linked here. I have been doing, you know, kind of doing this sort of thing for, well, about 2 decades now. It's going to be the 20-year anniversary of the website in August, where I had been reporting on, you know, news about world orthodoxy, true orthodoxy, ecumenism, etc. I would like nothing more than for ecumenism to go away among the Orthodox. I completely agree with what Father John said. I remember when people used to say that the Greeks are so disunited, but the Russians aren't. Well, look at it now. And then you have Romania, and you have Bulgaria, and you have, and what we're missing in all this confusion is that there's a great flowering of faith going on that is sometimes reorganizing better, sometimes not. But it's a process. What I've seen in 20 years to me is nothing short of miraculous. And so, you know, I mean, I think as long as people keep talking, eventually things will work. And as long as we make orthodoxy and the teaching of the church the basis by which we come to agreement, we'll see greater and greater things happen. I have faith in that. Or the Antichrist is coming. No idea. But I feel confident, at least these days. So, yeah, my channel, nftu.net, or just go to NFTU News and Apologetics on YouTube.
Now, I'm going to share a couple links, and it's to orthochristian.com. Is that a website both of you guys follow?
I think that's Father Jesse Dominic's. Is that? Or
yeah,
is that
well,
RoCor-True? Yeah.
He's not a clergyman, I don't think, but
I thought he was a priest.
I don't think so. I think he just
Jesse
translates.
Dominic's a layman last I was aware, but I saw him in 2019.
He just translates from the Russian website.
Maybe I saw TR and assumed it was PR. I don't know. Okay, anyway.
Well, anyway, just because in the last month, it seems like Southeast Asia is on Orthodox fire, which is great. We see regular Orthodox services being held in Laos for the first time. And so I rejoice in God that is occurring. I'm going to share and you can see this at orthochristian.com. There's our Laos Orthodox service be held in capital on a regular basis. That's how it starts. It started in Cambodia at the Bulgarian embassy. They have an iconostasis there. So we have that. And it looks like Father Joseph disappeared. So hopefully he'll come back real soon. I also want to show, let's see, another article on orthochristian.com so people are aware of the missionary work that's happening. A new Orthodox parish community in Vietnam. And I guess I scrolled to the bottom because I was hitting the link, but here we go. This was something because for a long time, from what I'm aware, Orthodoxy was actually illegal. It wasn't legally recognized, which is kind of common in Southeast Asia. They give legal recognition to certain what they call sects. Obviously, Orthodoxy is not a sect. We are the true church. But now Orthodoxy is allowed to exist in Vietnam and is now adding parishes. As you can see, some people are aware that's a lot of Russian-looking faces, and it's because generally that's how these parishes start, just like in biblical times. It starts among the converts in the synagogues in biblical times. Today, it starts among the Russian expat communities, and from there we evangelize locals to the Orthodox Christian faith. And so I bring this up because I just came back from Cambodia. I'm happy to see that the mission there has made incremental improvements from last year, and by God's grace, will continue to every single year. And it's unlike Vietnam and Laos. We got church buildings in Cambodia. We're very blessed. We're kind of working ahead of a lot of other missions in parts of Asia, and so we're starting ahead, which is why we could offer hospitality to those who want to go on a pilgrimage there. Want to visit the churches in Thailand, to Cambodia. Those who want to do mission work there, we could offer places to live. This is something where I'd like people to get in the ground floor and really support the mission in Cambodia, and that's always my plug. Is consider doing that or donate financially. orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. This is a time of year where it's actually we get our most donations because of the tax returns. So please consider supporting the mission in Cambodia, or consider, if not financially, through prayer or through becoming a missionary yourself. Something we would greatly appreciate for the growth of the mission there. Now we're going to just get into some audience questions and comments with our esteemed panel here. 30 words or less. Who wants to answer this? Why did the Matthewites break communion with ROCOR in the early 70s? We don't want a dissertation on this. Just give us the facts. Father Joseph.
The reality was, the Matthewites kind of thought that ROCOR's position on the new calendar was a full condemnation like their own. They were also getting accused by the Florinites of not having correctly redone their orders, because the ROCOR actually gave them a correction to their orders, and the Florinites took that as an opportunity to say, no, we need to reordain you all. The Matthewites got sick of it, thought everyone was lying to them, and broke communion.
All right, we have this. And this, I guess, is also Father Joseph. Where are the holy elders among the true Orthodox writing books on the spiritual life where they don't speak about ecumenism? To my knowledge, it doesn't exist very telling. So it seems like it's kind of a rhetorical question saying that the true Orthodox are only obsessed with their kind of political issues and, that stuff. They're not writing about spiritual matters and don't have saints. So what's your response to that?
Well, there was a book. If you give me just one moment, there was a book by Elder Ephraim, which was put out before he officially became part of Constantinople. It was published by Blanco, where it talks about not only the spiritual life, but the evils of ecumenism. And that was, I believe, with New Seraph Press. But give me just one moment. But the point is, there are Orthodox elders who have talked about ecumenism, and even some people who are recognized as elders among World Orthodoxy also talked about ecumenism. Elder Paisios talked about ecumenism, even though he said he didn't want to break from Constantinople. He was negatively disposed towards ecumenism. Romania, I'm pretty sure Elder... Is it Ali of Elder
But are there any
Romania?
true Orthodox saints that are the same? I think that was the question.
The concept of elderism is itself, in my opinion, kind of suspect. And I think, Father John, you would understand why we would say that. Having dealt with an anti-ecumenist elder who happened
But I guess let me frame the question maybe a little differently then.
Mm-hmm.
The true Orthodox have saints. You have a martyr that the Greek police killed. You have Saint Philaret of New York.
There's a lot of saints. And there's
do you have any spiritual saints, any ascetics?
In Greece, there are a couple that I'm sure that they would be able to name, but they'd be like fools for Christ, or I think one of them was an ascetic.
But that's your answer.
The problem is
you do have ascetic saints.
Yeah, we do have ascetic saints. It's just I don't think of any off the top of my head. But the point is, there is a tendency, especially among non-true Orthodox circles, to kind of be obsessed with elders, and it's just something that we're very skeptical about.
All right. Again, Father Joseph, and then the next one I promise to go to Father John. Why was it accepted for ROCOR to be in full communion with Serbia and Jerusalem, and the Greek calendars and not the Matthewites? Or maybe that's a Father John question.
Yeah, that's a weird question.
Father John.
Well, the question is, I'm not sure that it's entirely an accurate question, but it was a fact that we were in communion with those churches. Now, whether the GOC or the Matthewites were aware of that or believed that is another question.
All right. World Council of Churches, let's bring it up very quick. Obviously, Father Joseph, your view is that no matter what, it's bad to be part of it. The Normodox answer is going to be, well, we were part of it in order to do something good. Father John, could you give us your perspective on the question?
Well, the World Council of Churches obviously was involved with the Orthodox participants in the World Council of Churches were involved in some messy stuff. And I think one favor that one Greek Old Calendar group did back in the 90s was the Kyprianos Synod produced a series of videos where they exposed that this stuff was happening. And then they translated these videos into, they translated in English because it was originally in Greek, and they translated it into Russian. It might have begun in some other languages too, but I know that it had a very big impact because it showed people what was going on. And that, I think, led to Georgia and Bulgaria withdrawing from the World Council of Churches. Now, the Moscow Patriarchate suspended its participation in the World Council of Churches, but basically they leveraged their weight with the World Council of Churches to say, okay, we are going to leave the World Council of Churches unless you make changes to your constitution. So basically, the World Council of Churches had to no longer allow statements to be issued unless every church that was a member agreed to it, and they could no longer allow interfaith or interdenominational worship. And so since then, you haven't seen videos like that being produced because the World Council of Churches basically was, agreed to those terms. And the Moscow Patriarchate, I think, probably would withdraw from the World Council of Churches altogether, except for the fact that the Ecumenical Patriarch continues to be a member. And the last thing they want to do is leave the stage of the World Council of Churches to the Ecumenical Patriarch.
And give him all the power.
So that he could say whatever he thinks Orthodoxy is and have all these other people just assume that he's the spokesman for Orthodoxy.
Well, because he would like to be. We have this. It's pretty clear that the heart of the issue is whether or not ROCOR accepts the Rudder's interpretation, Canon 15 of 861 Constantinople. It pretty clearly vindicates the true Orthodox. So first, let me ask Father Joseph: would you say this canon and how it's been historically interpreted vindicates your ecclesiology?
I don't think we need to refer to. I don't think that the issue of whether ROCOR accepts the Rudder's interpretation or not is an issue. I've never met anyone in ROCOR, and I don't think Father John would deny what Canon 15 says, means, and the interpretation is. I think what it comes down to is really who they are choosing, who ROCOR chooses to recognize as holding the banner of Orthodoxy today. That's the way they used to do things many, many years ago. And many, many years ago, more people did in Serbia and in Jerusalem. And we live in a kind of an era where Orthodoxy has become a brand name or a tag. Like people just say, I'm Orthodox trademark symbol. And then they go and participate in a Hindu building ceremony like Athenagoras of New Jersey. So the point is that, until we start focusing once again on fidelity to orthodoxy and not unity at all costs, things won't get better.
Father John, response?
Well, the thing about Canon 15 of the First and Second Synod is that it says that you can withdraw from a bishop who's preaching heresy publicly. It actually doesn't say that you have to withdraw from that bishop. It says that you can, and it also doesn't say go set up your own parallel jurisdiction prior to a synodal verdict. Now, Canon 13 of that council says that you cannot withdraw from your bishop because he's breaking the canons, even though he might really be breaking the canons. And so what I would say about the old calendarist is was the new calendar a heresy that was being proclaimed publicly? And I don't believe that it was. I don't think it qualifies as a heresy. We've, for the reasons aforementioned, partly because everybody would have gone into heresy if that was true. And this council was held in the wake of what was known as the Moekian Schism, which was a schism that happened with St. Theodore the Studite and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who I believe was also a saint. So it's another example of two saints being on different sides of an issue. But it was over a emperor who divorced his wife for no good reason and wanted to enter into a fourth marriage, which was uncanonical. And the Patriarch of Constantinople didn't perform that wedding, but he also didn't prevent a archimandrite from performing that wedding, and that resulted in a schism that took some time to heal. And so I think that 13th canon was really designed to prevent that from happening in the future. And the 15th canon was basically saying, here's where you can separate.
I'm not sure if history rhymes or repeats, but I think that's a few different episodes all conflated into one.
Yeah,
the divorces and stuff.
If I seem visibly upset, it is because I'm sure you know the rest of the canon where I'm talking about whether it's pseudo bishops or not, and that can be debated. But more upsetting is the fact that I've seen this from a number of different people in world Orthodoxy, a number of apologists, a couple of one or two priests, etc., saying, and I'm shocked to hear you say it, because I've always respected your fidelity to staking, being straightforward with things. If you say that person's a heretic, but you don't have to break with them, well, then what's the point of the canon to begin with? I mean,
well, the key question is how clearly is heresy being preached? And I personally, if I was in a situation where my bishop was proclaiming heresy and it wasn't an ambiguous statement, I wouldn't have any qualms about not commemorating him. But that canon does not say go forth and establish your own jurisdiction.
Right, no.
Now, I do think a priest in that situation would have every right to appeal to another bishop if there was one that he could appeal to and come under his omophorion. But that's a little bit different. But so the canon does provide grounds for people to withdraw from people who are preaching heresy. But in the case of the new calendar, I don't think it qualifies as heresy. And matter of fact, I don't usually hear even old calendarists try to argue per se that it was a heresy. What they try to say is that it was sort of a part of the agenda that was heretical, which was ecumenism.
Yeah.
But when the Greek old calendar is separated from the Church of Greece originally, they were just breaking over the calendar. They were not breaking because they said you've got an ecumenist agenda. It was only later on that that argument began to be made, but it wasn't the initial argument.
Well, no, and that's fair, but I don't know where you are of this, but even in the 1940s, when the monasteries of Mount Athos were protesting, the Patriarch of Constantinople he said in writing that we'll settle this and we'll restore everything to normal. They didn't know about it because that encyclical was barely well known until the 50s. So yeah, the people were operating on intuition. I don't doubt that, but that didn't mean that they had the right to lose access to their churches and be killed. I mean, because that's what happened. It wasn't like these were random people. The state action was anyone celebrating on the Russian holiday was getting arrested.
Oh, Father Joe, it's not like you got killed. Stop taking it so personal.
Well, but the thing about that is while I would say that the Church of Greece handled that situation very badly, it's entirely parallel with the way the old believers were handled. They were persecuted, and yet, we don't say that the old believers were right.
Yeah, but there's a big difference. The old believers were not following consistency with the rest of the church, whereas the new calendar was an innovation. It's exactly the opposite as the old believers.
Well, what they were doing, though, is they were insisting on holding to the practices that have been handed down to them, and I can entirely sympathize with why they would say, you trying to say that my grandma and my grandfather were heretics because they made the sign of the cross this way? You're trying to say the books we've always been using are heretical? I think that whole situation was very poorly handled. And there's other things they could point to. If you read the autobiography of Archpriest Avacum, he points out things like, well, this metropolitan from Syria, they went into his cell because he was participating in the council of 1666 through 1667, and they found pounds of tobacco. So this guy smoked. And what he didn't know is the patriarch of Antioch that participated in that council was actually in secret communion with Rome. That's one thing that Father Peter Here's book points out. And so there's lots of reasons why they could point to say these people were bad, these people were not trustworthy, but we still don't say that they were right.
Well,
but that's
now
why
the
I say
Moscow
that there's
Patriarchate sells cigarettes, so there we go. We solved it.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that in this case, it's still the opposite, which is why the True Orthodox in Greece had so much sympathy, because what was being introduced and what they were resisting was the position of the rest of the Orthodox world. And so, it's weird to say that they're fighting against an innovation that the Russian Church itself does not hold. As a priest of the Russian Church, I would think that there would be more sympathy, and there was certainly at the time, and even among the Serbians.
Now,
it was.
I'm going to table this discussion because it would be screwing up part 2. Because this episode, well, why not? This one's about the schism. And then what we could talk about next time, perhaps by God's grace, would be the question of orthodoxy and some of these questions, because there's a given that, well, the true Orthodox are actually orthodox in all these questions, and there should be some pushback because there's theories of ecclesiology that are different, and so this is a question that we just can't solve tonight. Tonight was about the schism, and there's a great back and forth there, but if we're going to unpack, well, this is Orthodox, is heterodox, I think we would need more time to do that than in response to that audience question. I have this comment here, which is all ROCOR in Brazil now follow Angafango Metropolita. I didn't hear about that. What happened there?
I'm not sure that we don't have any parishes in Brazil, but the thing is, at the 2003 all clergy council that we had, what I saw from the representatives from South America was largely people who had been very isolated and whose communities had dwindled down significantly from what they used to be. We used to have something like 3 or 4 Latin American bishops, but the unfortunate reality is that ROCOR in Latin America made no effort to transition into Spanish. And so as time went on, they lost most of their people. And so we're not talking about very sizable communities, but you had a lot of these priests that basically they've been isolated. They had talked themselves into the idea that there was no way, not no how, and could we talk to the Moscow Patriarchate because there's not a God-anointed czar on the throne. And it's unfortunate that happened, but I think a lot of it just has to do with mishandling on the part of how those dioceses were handled. And it's sad, but I there certainly are Russian churches in Brazil that are not under Metropolitan Agafongo, but they're probably all Moscow Patriarchate if there's not a ROCOR parish there.
Now, we have this comment, Bulgaria or Georgia, good for you, but you're still in communion with monophysites. I think this is a comment about the kind of the jurisdictional deal made by the Antiochians with the Syriac Orthodox Church. And I just want people to be aware, we have a whole episode on this. Are the Eastern Orthodox already in communion with the Oriental Orthodox? It gets unpacked in quite a bit of detail, and the reality is there is no intercommunion. There's a changing of jurisdiction. It's a silly agreement in many respects, rightly condemned, but there's no intercommunion. So people should be aware of that. There's this, and actually, wait, Father Joseph, weren't you in that episode? I think you were. I'm pretty sure you were. You were in that episode.
I'm trying to think of. I don't know if I was in any. I know that I've spoken about.
I'm pretty sure you're in that. Well, anyway, we got this final one here, and this is for you, Father Joseph. Hero martyr Daniel Sazoyev was Moscow Patriarchate and is considered a saint by many, many faithful Orthodox. So I think the implication here is, right, if there's no, if they're not validly having orders and grace, how do we deal with saints like this?
Well, again, once again we've talked about saints being on opposite sides of the table, but having a similar confession of faith. Now, I think Father John brought that up, and I hate to say this because I'm going to bring up some uncomfortable things, and why I personally do venerate Father Daniel Sysoev, Sysoev. The point is, first off, he can't be considered a standard bearer of what's happening now. He didn't recognize, for example, the ROCOR. The second point that is important to remember here is, at the end of his life, before he died, he barely recognized the Moscow Patriarchate he was part of. He literally was saying things to the effect of, the Patriarchate is going to have to be literally destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up with new people. Those were some of the last writings he said before he was shot. And finally, and this is the biggest one, I am the first person to say he's a hierarch. I'd be glad to put up his icon. Why won't the Patriarchate? Because of the fact that their position is, because they have to adhere to the whole multiple faiths of Russia BS, and that he was a troublemaker. And there are actually people in the MP hierarchy who will say he should never be glorified because he doesn't represent what Orthodoxy is. Well, that's embarrassing. I certainly think he does, even if he didn't agree with my synod.
I'm sitting in a room with an icon of Father Daniel Sysoev.
That's why I was saying I respect Father John here, because he's.
So, I mean, the thing is, when it comes to the glorification of saints, it often takes time because you have people who have personal feelings that get mixed up in it. When St. John was glorified, Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles was adamantly opposed because he knew St. John, and St. John came into California, and Archbishop Anthony thought that all of California belonged to him, and he wasn't happy with it. But one thing that was very interesting was, although he absented himself from the services before the services were over, he showed up, and I was told that he had a dream of St. John, and that's why he decided to go ahead and come. So these kinds of things happen. But I have no doubt that Father Daniel is going to be glorified as a saint.
I will say two things. One, similar things happen with St. Philaret, because a lot of people, including like Vladimir Moss, was actually not a fan of St. Philaret before he was glorified, but he accepts them now. But the problem is that with martyrs, that's usually an instantaneous process. This, like, he should have been glorified ages ago, because there's nothing.
Well, you see this in other cases, though, like that soldier of Vasily, who was killed by the Chechens and tortured to death because he wouldn't take off his cross. He's not been officially glorified, but I think that the Moscow Patriarchate, they have a process for these things, and it takes time. I mean, when they glorified the new martyrs in 2000, for example, they didn't glorify every last new martyr by name that we had glorified. They investigated their lives. They've been adding, saints to their list constantly. I edit the Saint Innocent calendar, and I'm constantly having to update my calendar because they're constantly updating their calendar.
And with Father Daniel, he still has surviving family. His father's a priest. They're building a church. I've heard stuff where not everyone's happy about certain things surrounding that church. And so those are the sort of real world stuff that gets in the way of things like canonizations. But he will be canonized, I think, before the Lord comes back, but we never know when the Lord's coming back. Anyway, guys, it's there's so much more we could get into this question. We could always talk about a part 2 where we unpack some of the doctrinal issues. There'd be more stuff I'd have to chew on as well. But I just have to say I'm very grateful for, I would say, a first in the history of this topic to get two guys on different sides respectfully disputing the question. I really appreciate both of you coming on.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'd be glad to do another show with Father John if he wants on the subject. I have always regarded you as kind of an early mentor of mine. When I was a new catechumen, he recommended me for an essay in apologetics. Long story, but I've always had respect for you, and so I hope that if you want to do another one, I'll do it.
Sure.
It sounds like, looking at the com box, we're going to need to get Subdeacon Nectarios somehow involved at some point.
I would love to have him. He's an interesting guy. I've become fast friends with him recently. So yeah, I'm for you.
Well, guys, thank you again so much. And I will end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Rock. Fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Have a good night.